The year was 1987, and the fluorescent lights of Murphy's boxing gym cast harsh shadows across the weathered faces of fighters who had seen better days. In the heart of Philadelphia's blue-collar district, the gym stood as a testament to an era when boxing was king, when Rocky Balboa had inspired a generation to believe in the impossible. Marcus "Thunder" Williams wiped the sweat from his brow as he finished his evening training session. At 35, his black belt in karate and years of professional fighting had earned him respect in the neighborhood, but the glory days were behind him. His last championship bout had ended 3 years ago with a devastating loss that shattered more than just his jaw. Now, he spent his days teaching kids the discipline he wished he had maintained in his own life. The gym was emptying as Marcus packed his gear, the familiar sounds of heavy bags being stilled and gloves being hung echoing through the space. Philadelphia in the late 80s was a city trying to reinvent itself, caught between the industrial decay of the 70s and the promise of urban renewal that seemed always just out of reach. As Marcus stepped into the alley behind the gym, he nearly tripped over a figure huddled against the brick wall. The man was young, maybe 22, with hollow cheeks and clothes that had seen too many nights on the street. His dark skin was marked with the telltale signs of someone who had been fighting battles that had nothing to do with sport. "Hey, you all right?" Marcus asked, crouching down beside the homeless man. The young man looked up with eyes that held both wariness and a flicker of something Marcus recognized from his own mirror during the dark months after his last fight. It was the look of someone who had been knocked down so many times that getting up seemed pointless. "Just trying to stay warm," the young man replied, his voice hoarse but steady. "Sorry if I'm in your way." Marcus studied the stranger's hands. Despite the dirt and calluses from street life, there was something about the way he held himself, a subtle indication of controlled strength. "What's your name?" "David. David Carter." "You ever fight, David?" A bitter laugh escaped David's lips. "Every day. Just to survive." Marcus saw something in that moment that reminded him of his younger self, hungry and desperate, willing to claw his way out of poverty through sheer determination. The gym owner, old Murphy, had taken a chance on him 20 years ago when Marcus was just another angry kid from the projects. "You got anywhere to go tonight?" Marcus asked. David shook his head, pulling his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders. The October air in Philadelphia was getting colder, and winter was coming fast. Marcus made a decision that would change both their lives. "Come on, I've got a couch and some food. Tomorrow, if you want, I'll show you something that might interest you." David hesitated, years of street survival making him wary of kindness that came without a price, but the cold was seeping through his bones. And something about this man seemed different from the others, who had made promises they never kept. "Why would you help me?" David asked. Marcus stood and extended his hand. "Because someone once helped me when I needed it most, and because I think you might have something special inside you that just needs the right training to come out." As they walked through the narrow streets of South Philadelphia, past the row houses with their marble steps and the corner stores that stayed open late, Marcus began to explain his philosophy. Fighting, he told David, was not about violence or proving dominance. It was about discipline, respect, and finding the strength to overcome the obstacles that life threw in your path. David listened intently, his mind already beginning to shift from the survival mentality that had dominated his thoughts for months. For the first time in a long while, he felt something that resembled hope stirring in his chest. The two men walked in comfortable silence, their footsteps echoing off the pavement as they headed toward what would become the beginning of an extraordinary journey. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of Marcus's small apartment above the corner barbershop on Broad Street. David woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, luxuries he had almost forgotten existed. His body ached from sleeping on something softer than concrete for the first time in months, and for a moment, he wondered if the previous night had been a dream. Marcus was already dressed in his training clothes, moving around the small kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had lived alone for years. The apartment was sparse but clean, with boxing trophies on a shelf, and a photograph of a younger Marcus holding a championship belt. "Sleep okay?" Marcus asked, handing David a steaming cup of coffee. David nodded, still adjusting to the kindness of a stranger. "Better than I have in a long time." "Good. After breakfast, we're going to the gym. I want to see what you're working with." An hour later, they stood in Murphy's boxing gym as the morning crowd began filtering in. The gym was a different place in daylight, filled with the sounds of serious athletes preparing for their day. Jump ropes slapped against the floor in rhythm, and the steady thud of gloves against heavy bags created a percussion that David found oddly comforting. Murphy himself was a grizzled Irishman in his 60s who had seen every type of fighter walk through his doors. He looked David up and down with the critical eye of someone who could spot potential or the lack thereof in seconds. "This is David," Marcus said simply. "He's going to be training with me." Murphy raised an eyebrow but said nothing. In his world, results spoke louder than introductions. Marcus started David with basic stretching and conditioning. The young man's body was lean from months of inadequate nutrition, but there was a natural athleticism that became apparent as he moved. His reflexes were sharp, honed by life on the streets, where a split second of hesitation could mean the difference between safety and danger. "Tell me about your background," Marcus said as they worked through fundamental stances. David's story emerged in pieces throughout the morning. He had grown up in North Philadelphia, raised by his grandmother after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12. She had passed away 6 months ago, leaving him with nothing but medical bills and an eviction notice. He had been living rough ever since, picking up odd jobs when he could find them and learning to defend himself out of necessity. "Ever do any organized sports?" Marcus asked. "Some basketball in high school, before I had to quit to work," David replied, throwing a tentative punch at the heavy bag. "Why?" "Because fighting is like any other sport. It requires discipline, training, and respect for your opponent. But more than that, it requires you to face your fears and push past what you think are your limits." Marcus began teaching David the fundamentals of karate, starting with breathing techniques and basic blocks. The martial art demanded patience and precision, qualities that David's street life had not cultivated. His first attempts were clumsy, his movements too aggressive and unfocused. "Slow down," Marcus instructed. "Power without control is useless. Every movement should have purpose." As the days turned into weeks, David lived in Marcus's apartment and spent every waking hour at the gym. He swept floors and cleaned equipment to earn his keep, watching the other fighters and absorbing everything he could about their techniques and training methods. The other gym members were initially skeptical of the homeless man who had appeared among them. This was 1987 Philadelphia, where trust was earned through sweat and proved through performance. But David's dedication began to win them over. He was always the first to arrive and the last to leave, pushing himself through exercises that left him exhausted but hungry for more. Marcus recognized something special in David's approach to training. The young man had an innate understanding of distance and timing that could not be taught. More importantly, he possessed an unshakable determination born from having nothing left to lose. "You're getting stronger," Marcus observed one evening as they finished their session. "But strength alone won't make you a champion. You need to understand that every fight begins in your mind." David nodded, wiping sweat from his face with a towel that had seen better days. "What do you mean?" "I mean that the hardest opponent you'll ever face is yourself. Your doubts, your fears, your past. Until you overcome those, technique and conditioning are just tools without purpose." As winter settled over Philadelphia, David's transformation became visible to everyone at the gym. His hollow cheeks filled out, his movements became more fluid, and most importantly, he began to carry himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had found his place in the world. Spring arrived in Philadelphia with the promise of new beginnings, and David had been training for 6 months. His body had transformed dramatically from the skeletal figure Marcus had found in the alley. Proper nutrition and rigorous training had added 30 pounds of muscle to his frame, and his technique had evolved from desperate street fighting to disciplined martial arts. The gym buzzed with excitement as news spread about an upcoming tournament. The Mid-Atlantic Karate Championship was being held at the Philadelphia Convention Center in May, drawing competitors from across the region. It was not the biggest tournament in the martial arts world, but it was legitimate, sanctioned, and would offer David his first real test against trained opponents. Marcus initially had reservations about entering David so early in his training. 6 months was a remarkably short time to prepare someone for competitive fighting, even someone with David's natural abilities, but he could see the hunger in his students' eyes, the need to prove that his transformation was real and meaningful. Tournaments are different from street fights. Marcus explained as they reviewed footage of previous championships on the gym's old television. There are rules, referees, and judges. Your opponents will be disciplined fighters who have been training for years. David studied the screen intently, watching the fluid movements of black belt competitors. I understand the risk, but I need to know if all this training means something. Murphy overheard their conversation from behind the front desk, where he was updating membership records. The boy's got heart, he said in his thick Irish accent. Sometimes that counts for more than perfect technique. The decision was made to enter David in the brown belt division, a compromise that acknowledged his rapid progress, while not throwing him into competition against masters with decades of experience. The entry fee was $50, money that Marcus paid without hesitation despite his own financial struggles. Training intensified as the tournament approached. Marcus brought in sparring partners from other gyms, each presenting different fighting styles and challenges. David faced boxers, kickboxers, and traditional martial artists, learning to adapt his technique to counter various approaches. His first sparring session against Tommy Rodriguez, a Puerto Rican boxer from North Philly, was a revelation. Tommy's hand speed and footwork were superior to anything David had encountered, and he found himself overwhelmed by combinations that seemed to come from nowhere. "You're thinking too much," Marcus observed after David had been tagged repeatedly by Tommy's left hook. "Trust your instincts. Your body knows what to do if you let it." The advice proved crucial. In subsequent rounds, David stopped trying to anticipate every attack and began flowing with the rhythm of the fight. His karate training provided him with kicks and knee strikes that Tommy had not expected, while his street fighting background gave him an unpredictability that confused more technical opponents. Word of David's progress began spreading through Philadelphia's tight-knit martial arts community. Other instructors started dropping by Murphy's gym to watch the homeless man who was supposedly developing championship-level skills in record time. Some were skeptical, dismissing David as a novelty act. Others recognized genuine talent when they saw it. 3 weeks before the tournament, Marcus arranged for David to spar against Jimmy Chen, a second-degree black belt who had won the Mid-Atlantic Championship twice in the lightweight division. The session was intended to give David experience against elite-level competition without the pressure of actual tournament conditions. Jimmy was everything David was not: technically perfect, supremely conditioned, and completely confident in his abilities. For the first 2 rounds, he dominated David with superior technique and ring generalship. But in the 3rd round, something changed. David stopped trying to match Jimmy's technical perfection and began fighting his own fight. He used his reach advantage to keep Jimmy at distance, through combinations that mixed karate techniques with boxing fundamentals, and most importantly, refused to be intimidated by his opponent's reputation. The final exchange of the sparring session saw David land a spinning back kick that dropped Jimmy to one knee. It was not a knockout blow, but it was a statement that he belonged in the ring with elite fighters. "That was impressive," Jimmy said afterward, removing his protective gear. "You fight like someone who has nothing to lose." "Because I don't," David replied simply. As the tournament date approached, David's confidence grew. He understood that he was still developing as a fighter, that his technique needed refinement and his experience was limited. But he also knew that his journey from the streets to the tournament mat represented something more than athletic achievement. Marcus watched his students' progress with a mixture of pride and concern. He had seen talented fighters destroyed by premature exposure to high-level competition, their confidence shattered by defeats they were not ready to handle. But he had also seen champions emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, driven by motivations that transcended mere athletic ambition. The night before they left for the tournament, David and Marcus sat in the gym after everyone else had gone home. The space was quiet, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of city traffic. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you've already won," Marcus told his student. 6 months ago, you were sleeping in an alley. Tomorrow, you'll be competing against some of the best martial artists on the East Coast. David nodded, understanding the truth in those words while still feeling the nervous energy that preceded any important competition. "I won't let you down." "You couldn't if you tried," Marcus replied. "Now get some rest. Tomorrow we find out what you're really made of." The Philadelphia Convention Center was buzzing with activity as competitors from across the Mid-Atlantic region arrived for the championship tournament. The main competition floor had been divided into 6 rings, each surrounded by bleachers filled with family members, training partners, and martial arts enthusiasts. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation and nervous energy. David stood at the entrance, taking in the scope of the event. He had never been inside such a large venue, and the sheer number of competitors was overwhelming. Fighters in crisp white uniforms moved through warm-up routines with the confidence of seasoned athletes, their movements precise and practiced. "Stay focused on your own preparation," Marcus advised, guiding David toward the registration area. "Don't get caught up in what everyone else is doing." The registration process was efficient but intimidating. David received his competitor number, 47, and a schedule showing his first match at 11:30 in Ring 3. His division had 24 competitors, meaning he would need to win at least 4 matches to reach the finals. As they found space in the warm-up area, David began to notice the stares and whispered conversations from other competitors and coaches. Word had apparently spread about the homeless man who had trained for only 6 months before entering a major tournament. Some looks were curious, others dismissive, and a few openly hostile. "Let them talk," Marcus said, setting down their equipment bag. "Use their doubt as motivation." David's first opponent was announced as Kevin Morrison from Baltimore, a brown belt with 3 years of tournament experience. As David stretched and visualized his strategy, he watched Morrison warming up in another area. The Baltimore fighter was technically sound, with crisp kicks and smooth transitions between techniques. More importantly, he looked completely relaxed, as if he belonged in this environment. When their names were called, David walked to Ring 3 feeling his heart rate increase. The referee, a distinguished-looking black belt in his 50s, called both fighters to the center for instructions. Morrison extended his hand for the traditional pre-fight gesture of respect, and David noticed the calluses and scars that marked hands accustomed to serious training. "Fight!" the referee commanded, and the tournament began. Morrison opened with a series of probing kicks, testing David's reactions and distance management. David responded with a combination of punches and a knee strike that surprised his opponent with its speed and timing. The early exchanges were even, both fighters feeling each other out and looking for openings. 3 minutes into the 5-minute round, David began to implement the strategy he and Marcus had developed. He used his reach advantage to control distance, threw techniques in unexpected combinations, and most importantly, pressed the pace in a way that his more technical opponent was not prepared for. Morrison's conditioning began to show as David maintained relentless pressure. The Baltimore fighter's kicks became slower and less precise, and his defensive reactions started arriving a split second too late. With 90 seconds remaining, David landed a spinning heel kick to Morrison's midsection that dropped him to the mat. The referee counted Morrison out, and David's first tournament victory was complete. As he bowed to his defeated opponent, David heard the crowd's surprised murmur. This was not supposed to happen. The homeless man was not supposed to defeat a seasoned competitor in his first match. His second opponent, Michael Torres from New Jersey, had apparently watched David's first fight. Torres opened aggressively, trying to overwhelm David with a flurry of hand techniques and low kicks. But David had learned to handle pressure during his months of training, and he weathered the initial storm before counterattacking with precision strikes that found their target. Torres proved more durable than Morrison, surviving 2 knockdowns before the referee stopped the fight with 30 seconds remaining. David was now in the semi-finals, having defeated 2 experienced competitors in convincing fashion. The arena began to take notice of what was happening in Ring 3. Conversations stopped as David prepared for his semi-final match, and bleachers that had been half empty for earlier rounds were now filled with spectators drawn by word of the unlikely contender. Marcus remained calm as they prepared for the semi-final, but David could see the pride in his instructor's eyes. "You're fighting exactly the way we trained," Marcus said during the brief rest period. "Trust your preparation and stay aggressive." David's semi-final opponent was Carlos Mendez from Washington, D.C., a fighter with an impressive record and a reputation for technical excellence. Mendez had been competing in tournaments for 5 years and was widely considered the favorite to win the brown belt division. As they faced each other in the center of the ring, David could sense the difference in his opponent's demeanor. Mendez was not underestimating him, and the Washington fighter's eyes held the focused intensity of someone who recognized a legitimate threat. The semi-final proved to be David's most challenging fight yet. Mendez's footwork was superior. His timing was excellent, and his ability to counter David's attacks was frustrating. For the first time in the tournament, David found himself trailing on points as they entered the final minute of the match. Marcus's voice cut through the noise of the crowd during a brief pause in action. "Remember why you're here. Remember what you've overcome." Something shifted in David's approach. He stopped trying to out-technique Mendes and began fighting with the desperation and creativity that had kept him alive on the streets. His attacks became more unpredictable, his combinations more varied, and his willingness to take risks more pronounced. With 20 seconds remaining, David threw a jumping knee strike that caught Mendes completely off guard. The Washington fighter crumpled to the mat, and this time he did not get back up. David Carter, the homeless man who had been sleeping in an alley less than 7 months earlier, was in the finals of the Mid-Atlantic Karate Championship. The convention center had transformed into something resembling a boxing arena from the golden age of the sport. Word of David's unlikely run to the finals had spread throughout Philadelphia's martial arts community, and spectators packed every available seat around Ring 3. Local media representatives had arrived to document what was being called one of the most surprising tournament performances in recent memory. David sat in the corner, his body exhausted from 3 demanding fights, but his mind sharper than it had ever been. Across the ring, his final opponent prepared with the methodical precision of a seasoned champion. Robert the Technician Sullivan from Pittsburgh was everything David was not: polished, experienced, and carrying the expectations of everyone, who believed the natural order of things should not be disrupted by homeless men who learned to fight in 6 months. Sullivan was a 2-time defending champion in the brown belt division, with tournament victories spanning 3 years and a fighting style that combined textbook technique with strategic intelligence. He had been competing since he was 12 years old, training at one of Pennsylvania's most prestigious martial arts academies under masters who had studied in Japan and Korea. "Look at me," Marcus said, gripping David's shoulders as they prepared for the final match. "You belong here, not because of your technique, not because of your conditioning, but because of your heart. Sullivan has never faced anyone who has overcome what you have overcome." The referee called both fighters to the center of the ring, and the convention center fell silent except for the hum of television cameras that had been hastily arranged to broadcast the final match. David looked across at Sullivan and saw something he had not encountered in his previous opponents: genuine respect mixed with calculation. "This is your moment," the referee announced to both fighters. "Champion yourselves with honor." The final began with Sullivan demonstrating why he was considered the division's best fighter. His kicks were perfectly timed, his hand techniques flowed in seamless combinations, and his defensive positioning seemed to anticipate David's attacks before they were fully formed. For the first 2 minutes, David found himself consistently on the defensive, absorbing punishment while looking for opportunities that seemed not to exist. The crowd watched in fascination as Sullivan methodically broke down David's aggressive style. This was what was supposed to happen when raw talent met refined technique, when inspiration collided with preparation. Sullivan was demonstrating that there were no shortcuts in martial arts, that years of dedicated training could not be replaced by determination alone. But as the match entered its 3rd minute, something began to change. David's conditioning, honed by months of relentless training and years of survival on the streets, began to show its value. Sullivan's techniques remained precise, but they were arriving with less speed and power. The Pittsburgh champion was discovering that David's ability to absorb punishment exceeded his capacity to deliver. Marcus watched from the corner as his student began to implement the lessons they had worked on for months. David stopped trying to match Sullivan's technical perfection and started fighting his own fight. He used his reach advantage to control distance, mixed karate techniques with boxing combinations that Sullivan had not prepared for, and most importantly, maintained the relentless pressure that had characterized his entire tournament run. The turning point came with 90 seconds remaining in the match. Sullivan threw a combination that should have ended the fight, catching David with a clean shot to the jaw that would have dropped most opponents. David absorbed the blow, smiled, and immediately counterattacked with a series of strikes that backed Sullivan against the ropes. For the first time in the match, the convention center erupted as spectators realized they were witnessing something special. This was not just an athletic competition anymore. It was a demonstration of what was possible when someone refused to accept the limitations that others placed on them. Sullivan's corner began shouting instructions, recognizing that their champion was in unfamiliar territory. He had never been pressured like this in a tournament setting, never faced an opponent who seemed to grow stronger as the match progressed rather than weaker. With 30 seconds remaining, David threw the combination that would define his life: a jab to set up distance, a low kick to compromise Sullivan's base, and a spinning back fist that caught the Pittsburgh champion flush on the temple. Sullivan dropped to the mat like he had been shot, and the convention center fell silent as everyone waited for him to rise. The referee began his count as Sullivan struggled to clear his head. At 8, the champion managed to get to his feet, but his legs were unsteady and his eyes unfocused. The referee took one look at Sullivan's condition and waved off the match. David Carter was the new Mid-Atlantic Karate champion. The crowd's reaction was unlike anything the venue had ever witnessed. People were on their feet applauding, cheering, and many were crying as they watched the homeless man who had been sleeping in an alley 7 months earlier being presented with a championship trophy. Marcus embraced his student as reporters and photographers surrounded them. "I knew you had it in you," he said, his own eyes filled with tears. "I knew from that first night that you were special." In the months that followed, David's story became legend in Philadelphia's martial arts community. He used his championship victory as a launching pad for a professional fighting career, eventually earning enough money to open his own gym in the neighborhood where Marcus had found him. But more importantly, David never forgot the lesson that night had taught him, that champions are not born from privilege or perfect circumstances, but from the willingness to continue fighting when everyone else has given up hope. Years later, when people asked David about the secret to his success, he would always give the same answer: "I learned that the strongest opponent you will ever face is the voice in your head that tells you to quit. Once you defeat that voice, everything else becomes possible." The boy who had slept in alleys had become a champion, proving that in America in 1987, dreams were still achievable for those brave enough to pursue them.